One of the examples that's often cited, so listeners who are familiar with space will have heard of it before, but think about the insurance industry and how they need to monitor the various assets they insure.
Matt, Brendan, thank you so much for being here. It is great. I've really enjoyed preparing for this podcast. In addition to reading the book, I listened to all kinds of content that you have out there, and it really flipped my mind on what space actually is and what the near-term opportunities are. So it is a real gift to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for being here, Kai. And I can't tell you how glad we are, especially to speak to people who spend their days thinking about strategy. It's Brendan and one of our core goals is that this book would reach exactly your audience who's thinking around the corner. So thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for having us.
Yeah, and to bring kind of the academic, big thinking, big picture view, and then the strategist view of like what is happening now. The zoom out, zoom in is really special. It's good they guys teamed up together. I always start with the same two questions just to warm us up a little bit. I'd like each of you to answer the question. Let's start with Brendan. Complete the sentence for me. If you really know me, you know that.
Oh,
This can have nothing to do with your work at all.
oh man. If you know me, you know that I speak French and love everything France related. My last name is Rosseau, and so I've got some French family. They moved here before World War One, but one of my favorite things to do is head back over there and see where my roots came from. So
Cool.
it's one of my favorite things.
And did you learn French like in school?
Mais oui.
Ah, excellent.
But you lose it, so you got to practice it every day.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
amazing. It's like it's almost like reaching for a tool where you haven't spoken French in like a year, and you're like, oh, it's definitely right there. I can just grab it and use it right away. And turns out the tool has rusted, so you need to
Right. You got to keep
you
it
gotta
sharp
keep it.
and yeah, I've been using a platform called Preply, and I just do once a week, just like a 1 hour Zoom German and 1 hour Zoom Spanish,
I
just
need to do
to
that.
keep it going. Yeah, excellent, excellent. And Matt, what about you? What if you really know me, you know that?
Well, if you really know me, you know that I love lakes. I grew up in
Huh.
Minnesota, land of 10,000 lakes, although most Minnesotans will tell you that's an understatement. And so I think for those reasons, if I can spend time at a lake, I'm a happy guy.
That's awesome, awesome. And so we'll stay with you, Matt. Second question: what's your definition of strategy? I ask this of all of our guests, and we always get a
Yeah.
different answer. So whatever you say is right.
I was so glad you asked, because I'm not a strategy professor, so I've never had to put into words how I think about this question, how I think of this concept. But it's funny, in addition to working on space, I am currently serving as the faculty chair of the MBA program at HBS, so I spend a lot of time actually trying to think about and execute strategy. And so I
Hmm.
tried to reflect on how I would define it. And so here's what I came up with, which is it's about choosing core objectives and then deciding how to use scarce time and resources to achieve them. So nothing particularly
Hmm.
surprising in that one, but that's how it's been for me, anyways.
Well, I think the scarcity is particularly apropos for the topic of space, right? Because you're working in which access to resources is difficult or
For
often
sure.
impossible.
A lot of
Yeah,
our startups are
interesting.
struggling with that all the time. So
Yeah, yeah. Excellent. Great. Brent?
Well, Matt's definition, I completely agree with this, so I don't know how much I can improve on it. But I would say, for me, though I'm early in my career, one area that I've seen strategy be incredibly important and sometimes overlooked is choosing the activity of choosing the right goal, a very specific goal that kind of makes you or your company or your organization what it really can be. A lot of times I've seen um, organizations kind of hand wave through okay, so we want to be the best at this. And the organizations I've really loved that I've been proud to be part of are the ones that get very specific and say, we are going to be the best at either manufacturing this specific thing or doing this specific thing in this kind of way because it reflects the kind of people we want to be, and just the specificity for me it lets it sink in a lot more, trickle through the organization, and so I whenever it's time for me to execute a strategy or choose goals, I never skip
Yep.
that component of it.
That's great. Yeah, because I think that'll be interesting. Eventually, we'll talk a little bit about what is it that Blue Origin wants to be, and is that different than what SpaceX wants to be, and are the paths? Because it seems like the paths are different, but or the destination's different as well, and others that are playing.
Good question. It's a great segue to
Yeah.
space.
Yeah, right, exactly. So let's talk about space first. I think that, like me, as I was preparing for this, a lot of our listeners are thinking, when they think space, they're thinking, I don't know, some decade or decades from now, there are some people on Mars, and you teach a class on with students, executive ed people as well, and they're talking about near term opportunities. So first, just kind of make it real for us. Talk to us a little bit. What are those near term entrepreneurial opportunities that you encourage students to look at? How can we make money on this now?
That's a great question. And let me just say, I'm glad you mentioned our students because it really is vital to what we've been trying to do. I'm fortunate to teach at Harvard Business School. Brendan worked with me for 3 years there on our research and the writing about space, the book, Space to Grow, that recently came out, and what we're going to talk about in part today as well. But we also created this course that we've now taught for 3 years to MBA students, and there's about 95 students in the class each year, and only a dozen or so of them have direct experience in the space sector coming into
Really?
school. And so, very much to your question, most of the ones in the room are curious about how they might use space in their careers, whatever industry they find themselves in, right out the door. Right, they're about to graduate. How can they use it? And we really like to stress that point that space is already completely essential to our way of life. I think most of us take that for granted, and we can explore various ways in which that's true, but also the expanding reach of space in terms of internet satellite constellations, Earth observation, as we often refer to it, data through and from space, has the potential to transform essentially every industry that your listeners work in and help to lead. And so we are really eager to get folks, whether it's in agriculture or finance or even on the ESG side of things, to be thinking about how they might incorporate data through and from space into their business models.
Yeah, I think one of the traps that we see folks run into when they think about space is typically when we imagine space activities, it's kind of the Apollo era, boots on the moon or giant space stations. It's explorations. It's things almost by definition that are completely apart from normal day-to-day business. But what I think is changing today with the introduction of the private sector coming in and making space activities more routine and cheaper and unlocking all kinds of new capabilities, I think what's changed is that it's forcing us to reevaluate as a society what is space and what is it good for. It's really just a place out there where we can put technologies that do certain things. There's no prescribed way to do space, and we've seen companies lean in to especially to what Matt mentioned, data that's coming through space and data that's being captured from space, to better execute their business models, to execute new and bold strategies. And it's really been exciting to be at this moment in particular where we're at an inflection point of what's possible in space and seeing more and more value being created from there.
So just to help us visualize that, can you give us an example of an existing or hypothetical soon revenue opportunity from data in space?
Oh, sure. So one of the examples that's often cited, so listeners who are familiar with space will have heard of it before, but think about the insurance industry and how they need to monitor the various assets they insure. Now, of course, you can send agents out to do that monitoring. You can try to leverage technology to do that. But especially if you're insuring assets at scale or that are remote, the ability to monitor those assets in a real-time, quick way, and increasingly in sophisticated ways. So your listeners might think, okay, yeah, I can get some grainy picture from space, but like, how's that actually going to help me? Turns out many, many startups have formed over the past decade that leverage increasingly sophisticated technology to measure things like moisture levels in soil and temperature and various emissions down even actually below the surface. They can penetrate even into the soil. And so insurance companies have a huge interest in being able to monitor their assets more efficiently and quickly. That's just one example.
Yeah, and another one is, and users might be, or listeners rather, might be familiar with this, is SpaceX's satellite constellation called Starlink. So it's a relatively new system. The first prototype satellites went up just in 2019, so only a few years ago. But already they've launched and put into orbit thousands of these, internet satellites into low Earth orbit. They provide high-speed connectivity to any point on the Earth, and that's may seem like kind of a mundane thing. We're used to being in Wi-Fi connectivity, or at least internet connectivity. But huge parts of the earth have no internet at all, and even fewer have um, high speed connectivity. And so it's been an amazing thing to be able to provide at a moment high speed internet connectivity to every part of the world. And it's just getting better every day. And we've seen companies, everything from Maersk, the shipping conglomerate, to United Airlines, to everything in between. There's now over 5 million users, and it's generating billions of dollars a year. And it's a really unique kind of value for the moment. The main impact has been providing internet to places where it's has not been before. So kind of allowing us to do familiar things with internet access, just in maybe less familiar places. But in the long run, people are really excited about, what does this mean for 21st century infrastructure when we have a high speed, always online web of connectivity that truly blankets the globe? What does that mean for self-driving cars, or drones, or planes,
Mm-hmm,
or
mm-hmm.
everything in between? Could you have businesses that are fully autonomous? They're executed by machines that don't need to be operated by humans, regardless of where they are in the world. So we're not there yet, but we're at a really interesting inflection point where those kinds of conversations that maybe once were sci-fi seem a little bit less out there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
if I could, oh, do you
Yeah.
mind? This is just so
Yeah.
fun to talk about because there may be listeners out there who are thinking, yeah, okay, data, that's interesting. I'm not really sure mobile internet's that useful to me, or Earth observation. But if you're in an industry that makes, physical objects, I mean, this is a little farther down the line, but we've been talking just about data. Another one of the other areas people are really excited about in space is manufacturing. Uh, and this has been a dream that's been held for decades in space, but we're finally getting to the point, we hope, where the costs of doing it and the capabilities of doing it are going to really change, and be able to drive some value for various sectors. Pharma is
You're
one
talking
that
about
is
manufacturing in zero gravity conditions. Is that what
exactly
you've?
in
Mm-hmm.
microgravity. That's yeah. Thanks for clarifying.
Microgravity.
Right. So a fun thing perhaps for the audience to think about is the idea that what is special about space. Brendan made a great point. Like, space is just a place. We talk about that a lot in the book. It's like Latin America or anywhere else. It's a place to do things, increasingly. But it does have its own natural resources, like other places might, and one of those is microgravity. It's really hard to generate microgravity at scale for long periods of time on Earth. And so, does that change the manufacturing processes, the R&D processes for things that might be really quite valuable, and therefore create opportunities that, again, thinking around the corner a bit, 5, 10 years from now,
Yep.
it might be a reality.
And so then I'm thinking about, if we imagine, I'm just visualizing these factories and stuff getting transported up and down, and all the products that now can be made more economically or with better performance, or that
Yeah.
don't couldn't be made before. There are a whole bunch of services around that and other providers around that. What are some of those that might emerge?
Well, exactly. The picks and shovels. Yeah, no, that's right. There's a booming industry these days in the startup world in space to provide what's called satellite servicing, or moving satellites to different orbital locations, and exactly the sort of thing you're talking about. So one nice example is refueling. Right, so we've sent satellites up with carrying a certain amount of fuel they're going to need to maneuver and to operate over time. But what if you could kind of pull up a mobile gas station and refuel them so that they could extend their life and maybe provide some fix-its as well when you're there? That's a whole new sector.
Yeah, a lot of what we're seeing being created in space today. There was first in the 2000s and 2010s. There was a disruption in the launch industry. So it's the indispensable capability to get into space is launching a vehicle into orbit, and we saw companies like SpaceX, but SpaceX in particular, bring the cost way down, 90% lower than what it cost during the space shuttle era, and then now they're working to bring those costs down again. So we first saw a disruption in launch, and then as that wave kind of trickled out, then satellite companies started thinking, wait a minute, launches are a lot more frequent, they're a lot more cheap. What if we rethought how we built satellites? And then we saw a lot of cheaper, smaller, more numerous, kind of that move fast and break things approach came into the
Mm-hmm.
satellite industry, which really transformed it. We're in the midst of that change today. And then now we're seeing even larger changes when it comes to commercial space stations or beyond, or, okay, these satellites are going to need servicing. We're seeing those ripples of disruption move further and further. And it's really exciting because they're building up the capabilities and infrastructure that it takes to execute more and more sophisticated, more low cost, more high cadence space activities. And for most people, they might just think, okay, that's great. I'll see it on the news sometime, some cool space images. But it's really the start of um, bringing about capabilities that really matter to folks back here on Earth. One of the critical changes that I think we have to get across here is that there are, with the introduction of market forces in the past 20 years, more and more of space activity is being driven by space companies. And that's a fundamental change from everything we've known about space through NASA's history and beyond. Um, that matters for us because if space companies are leading the way, then they need customers. They need
Mm-hmm.
customers by definition to stay alive. And the vast majority of these space companies are not going after some pie in the sky, let's go terraform Mars, or let's go do, some crazy thing that isn't super relevant to folks on the ground. They're interested in how do we serve businesses where they are today? How we provide a capability that,
Mm-hmm.
terrestrial businesses don't even know they need yet, but could be hugely disruptive in the future. So that for us is part of what makes this so exciting. And
Yes.
it feels like we're at a moment where enough time has passed that it's definitely real. We've seen businesses lean in, and normal folks and organizations kind of benefit from what's going on in space. But also, there's so much that is exciting that's ahead of us. So it's a great time for
Mm-hmm.
listeners of this podcast to be thinking about space.
Yeah, no, this is popping several things for me. One is if we think about, say, the founders of Blue Origin and SpaceX, they've kind of all both have this model of, make do something small, make money to fuel the next thing, to fuel the next thing. So we start seeing this near-term opportunity that maybe didn't exist before. So that's why the government sort of had to monopolize the funding of these very long-term things. But what has changed? You talk about the NASA viewing itself less as the funder and more as a customer. Just talk to me, like, how did that come to be, and what's the mindset like from, I don't know what you call it, monopolist to market maker. You're muted, or I don't hear you.
Thanks.
That
It's a fascinating story, actually. I'm really glad you asked about it. Because I think a lot of us, including Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and a lot of the folks who are driving the space industry over today, grew up in an era when you think of space, you think of the space shuttle, or maybe you think of the Apollo missions, you think of big government-led space programs. And for the first 50 years of the space age, that's what it was. In fact, there's an amazing quote from one of the early founders of SpaceX, Jim Cantrell. He says, in the early 2000s, he's looking back at the first 50 years of the space sector, and he says, the great American space enterprise that defeated communism in defense of capitalism was and is operating on the Soviet economic model. And the irony of that was really quite poignant, that we had run this centrally commanded a single driver space sector for so many years. And that worked wonders in its early days. I mean, you can't take away from the accomplishment of those first few decades in space, and even in the subsequent decades, amazing engineering achievements. But over time, that model started to show its age, and it started to show the weaknesses of not having market forces of competition and the price mechanism and various things that we all know drive efficiency and innovation. And so in the early 2000s, many of your listeners will remember the space shuttle had its second accident in 2003, second tragedy. And at that point, that was sort of a crisis point for the general space enterprise. People realized we had to try something different. And so there was a little pilot program run out of NASA called Commercial Orbital Transportation Services that seeded some of these startups that have now grown into these massively important companies to resupply the International Space Station through a different model. And you asked what changed, and I'll just highlight three key things that really shifted and that made this much more, as Brendan was saying, a market than it was before. The first is that NASA decided to be one customer among many. So, kind just like you were saying, rather than being the only customer, they decided to tell these companies, look, we want to support you, but you should also build things that you can sell to other people. A second was that NASA decided to provide insight rather than oversight. So NASA has amazing people with amazing experience and ideas and expertise. They can help companies do the job better, but rather than monitoring them, they want to support them with the insight. And then the third was it sounds kind of um, technical or in the weeds, but it was a shift from contracting that provided a margin over a cost, so cost plus contracting it's called, to a fixed price method of contracting, where you pay these companies to deliver something for a certain amount of money. And you can imagine all the incentive changes that engenders, and really brought market forces in that we've been now living 20 years since seeing those market forces play out.
So I just want to double click on that so I understand. What I'm envisioning is, whereas before it was a long-term contract with Lockheed Martin that was billions of dollars, now it is I'll buy from I don't know, short-term contract, more transactional, I guess. Is that what we're saying?
Typically, what they think of as buying services. So before, NASA would say, we're going to build the space shuttle, and so we're going to contract out the manufacturing of, the door that goes to the crew hatch to, whoever.
Yes.
And so before, but they would give them as Matt mentioned, like a cost plus amount, so that they cover their cost plus a
That's what
margin, and
okay.
so they were supervising them, and that's how NASA did most of its business for most of its history. Now there's been a real push, especially since the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services (COTS), the program that essentially created SpaceX and so many other companies. Because that's been so successful, now there's a big push where NASA is hoping to acquire services and be one purchaser out of many of these services than others. So it's moving away from owning and operating the things that it doesn't have to. So when NASA wants a ride to space now to launch either a crew or cargo or its fantastic satellites like the James Webb, it buys a launch like any other customer would. When it wants somewhere to put its astronauts now, as the International Space Station is getting retired, it's going to buy services from commercial space stations. Of course, there's things that NASA will always be the only institution doing. It's a public research focused institution. So when it comes to exploring the moon or doing all kinds of other things, basic science and R&D, NASA will be the one doing those. But the big change is that it's been looking at how do we incorporate the private sector as much as possible to do things more efficiently, more lower cost, and be more sustainable. So we don't just have these, kind of boots on the moon and then never to go again for the next 50 years outcomes like we had with Apollo.